Mm, no. Um, I mean, there's a variety of different things that you can sort of do to. There's different approaches if you want to avoid conflict, or like at least being drawn into a conflict. So there's like the Swiss version, which is armed neutrality, which is you're basically setting yourself up with enough deterrence and enough force that no one really, in terms of the balance of power, no one wants to draw you into the war because it's just a lot more faff, and it doesn't serve someone's overall purpose in the calculus of power. Um, it doesn't serve them well to have you on against them, and it's much better just to have you as an outside power. Um, Alternatively, you can try and do as much as possible to stop yourself from being a threat, so that in the hopes that another country will basically say, this country has very little strategic importance, or is, it's not trying to antagonize, they're not a threat to us, so what's the point in worrying about them? They made it quite clear they're not going to be a threat. So in cases like that, Belgium did a lot in the lead up to World War II to prevent it from looking like a threat. It actively stopped France from extending the Maginot, that kind of thing. You can do other things. Historically, countries have got other countries to guarantee them, to try and help make sure that they don't get drawn into wars. Um, just declaring neutrality makes it very clear that it basically says we have no interest of joining either side. So in that way, sides can plan in advance and make sure that they don't see you as someone that's an unknown or something like that. Um, I think that's about it that I can think of. Another one, I thought, another way of, historically at least, in terms of things to consider in steps to ensure your neutrality or avoiding conflict. One thing is how much you actually enforce your own, um, like, borders and stuff, or what policy you have to that. So at least in World War II, there was a lot of things in terms of the question of neutrality, of as to whether or not to impound, planes or whatever that went over their territory, or ships that went into their territory or whatever. Because on one hand, if you let them, go through or whatever, you're not risking an altercation there. And that's one thing that they could have done. And in that sense, they would have maintained their neutrality in that sense. On the other hand, one of the other things they did, especially the Swiss, is that they would impound them. They'd impound whichever side went into their territory. So they did make confrontations, and they did have minor, I suppose, actual, like, altercations in that sense with those sides. But they did it in a way that basically, fended off both sides, and supported their own neutrality in the sense that they bit back. And the only other thing I thought is another thing that avoids conflict, and this is really not something you can do policy wise, but it's just a natural thing, is a lot of countries, whether in World War II or further back, they managed to get away with not being conquered or whatever, or falling into the conflict by simply being so small. So you see a lot of the micronations in the wars or whatever, in major wars, just sit by and they don't get pulled into it simply because they're so small, or they're so forgettable, or they're not in the way, that they're not actually taking an active stance, that people can, afford to just forget about them in the grand scheme of things. Oh yeah, well that's a bit bigger. I'm talking like San Marino, for example, is the
Yeah,
one I was thinking of.
yeah,
The
that's a
Vatican's
good one.
another. Yeah, to add to that as well, I think the thing to always keep in mind when it comes to just in general, it's not just material aid, but any kind of support when you go into rather than neutrality, non belligerency, is that a lot of things to consider is to the enemy or whatever, whoever you're supporting against. Um, how worth is it? How much is it worth for them to include you in a war or to take action against you instead? So,
Yeah.
for instance, when it comes to material aid, they're probably unless they are already intending to go to war with you or whatever, they're not going to go to war with you over you sending aid because logically, then all of your aid is joining the war, and your entire industrial force is now contributing to the enemy war effort against them. So logically, that it doesn't escalate in that sense, but it will proportionally lead to the two big things is they will begin doing things like sanctions or stuff that isolates you and cuts you off, which brings you further onto one side. Or if the war does go in the favor of the person you're trying to pester, say let's say Spain, for instance, supported Germany and Germany lost in World War II, it led to international ostracization because the winners now controlled everything and they knew that Spain had been supporting the other side. So it caused a very difficult situation that Spain was at that point very paranoid about of a potential invasion. It's just in general, like, war loans is something that you can give to other countries. Like, the big example is before World War I and World War II, America effectively bankrolled a lot of the Allied war efforts. So particularly Britain in World War I, France as well. And they needed a lot of money to sustain war economies. War economies, by their very nature, are unsustainable because you're focusing pretty much your entire industry back to the bare minimum um, left for civilian. You're focusing pretty much all of it towards winning the war because the other side is. So by its very nature, you need to find somewhere else to get the money who is producing, and so they'll turn to other countries, and it'll tend to be neutral countries. Switzerland's another example. Ireland a little bit. All these different places that will give these loans and so forth and IOUs that you give back to sustain your war. And that's really important from an economic standpoint. So that's another way that America, for instance, had a major effort, major role in supporting the Allies in both of the world wars. No, not really. I don't think so. I could talk a bit about it. So basically, if you're neutral in a conflict, a lot of the gains are pretty much economic. You can also get into a lot of things like morality and things like that. But from a more sort of, I guess, practical standpoint, um, if you're neutral, anyone who is trying to say you're in World War II, you're well World War I, Spain, they stayed neutral during the First World War, and as a consequence, because France, Germany, Britain, all these major countries were at war, you had blimps bombing cities for the first time and all this sort of thing. You had conquered territory being looted. Places like Spain become a hub for investment. So if you're an investor and you're thinking, where shall I set up my new shoe factory or whatever, you look to places like Switzerland or Spain rather than World War II Nazi Germany or something like that, because not only are these places constantly being bombed or at risk of being bombed, or there's an uncertainty if that place will even still be in Germany in 2 years' time, But these places, because they're raw economies, will constantly be taxing you. They will be trying to renovate these places into war production facilities, which aren't really profitable because they're taken control by the government, or they won't be useful in 2 years' time once the war is over. This kind of thing. So if you're an investor or you're trying to set up somewhere, the best places are the places not at war. There are cases as well if someone's in a war but they're so far away from the war, they'll benefit as well. But by and large, it mostly applies to neutrals, which is why America prospered in World War One and Two compared to Britain. Because the America was a safe spot, and for most of it, they were out of the war. So a lot of the Allied economies and stuff moved there, or they invested and set up there, and they weren't destroyed. So that's the biggest gain in terms of staying out of it. And same with banking and all that kind of thing. They'll always try and set you up because you're the sanctuary. You're reliable. Of course, because you're neutral and you're out of the war, your infrastructure is not going to be destroyed if you start losing or you get raided or whatever. You're not going to be mobilized into a war economy and stuff, which, as I've already covered, basically exhausts you and shovels you with debt. Britain in World War One started as a creditor to the entire world, and they was a net exporter and so forth. By the end of World War One, they were indebted and so forth. So staying out of wars prevents that kind of thing from happening and getting shoveled in debt and all this kind of stuff, or having to go into rationing, that kind of thing. I think that, and as well, in some cases, your country might not want to even be in the war. A lot of places just don't want to get involved in a war, especially if they don't have much to gain from it. So it's better to get, if you're a political party leader, to say, oh, we're not going to get in the war, this is not our war, and so forth, and everyone goes, yay, or whatever. So it might be prudent in that sense as well. And lastly, as well, if you actually do want to get into the war or whatever, or you're trying to be opportunistic, if you stay out of the war, countries on both sides will try and find ways to get you in the war. So, for instance, in World War One, Italy, they stayed neutral at the very beginning, and historically they had claims on parts of France, and they had claims on parts of Austria, which was on the other side. And both countries, or both factions, kept trying to appeal to Italy, saying, hey, if you join our side, we'll make sure you get all this land and all this, we'll get all this money, we'll support you, we'll provide you this. And so they in that sense, you can bargain and you can get a lot more favorable terms in exchange for you abandoning your neutrality down the line and joining a certain side. So, yeah, that's what I think I'd say. I will give a disclaimer on one case. Um, while it is a lot to gain, the flip side to also consider. At least I mentioned Spain, and I imagine some people now. I know I don't think anyone was thinking this, but they you could think, hang on, Spain of infamously after World War I fell into a complete civil war, and it's hardly a powerhouse today. And that's because after World War One, it had all these jobs, all this employment and stuff from supporting the war. But suddenly, after World War One, the industry and the demand and stuff for guns, for shipping and stuff suddenly tanked. And so there was a massive unemployment crisis and an economic depression in Spain because of that, because they had built up a complete dependency around the war. Um, and which then was effectively a bubble, and it popped the moment the war ended. So that is a disclaimer. It obviously doesn't come into the side of all the things to gain from it. It's just a thing to consider, I'd say, if you go into wars, and a little aspect to maybe consider if you want to add to plot. Hmm? Um, what for things that like when it becomes better to just join the war? Um, Historically, sometimes in places like Italy, the population really wanted war. They wanted to get involved. There was a lot of, we need to do our bit against Austria to take back our territory and form Greater Italy and stuff. And that drove a need to join the war because the people demanded it. Um, and coming into that, there's territorial possibilities. So you might want to join a war because it's, you'll get more, regardless if you get bombed or you lose industry or whatever. You'll get more out of it in the long term by getting more land or defeating a rival or something like that. Long term survival, if you think, if one side wins, then you're basically buggered. You might want to join a war preemptively. Um, and then you've already sort of mentioned this in another section, but obviously once a war starts becoming basically so obvious that one side's going to come out of it, it's probably more hassle to be we support both sides than it is to support the one side that controls 99% of the world or something like that. Um, so a lot of countries did that at the end of World War One and Two. You see all these South American, Central American countries suddenly hop on board and go, we've always supported the Allies after Germany was always losing. So it's stuff like that. That often cases where it becomes more favourable to actually join the war. Don't think so. Um, I think the Napoleonic War. I think same as Switzerland. Um, so others on that list is Liechtenstein. That's the tiny little principality in Europe for anyone who's never heard of that before. It's a tiny little principality, but it's things that it's notable for in terms of neutrality is that one, it doesn't care who invests in it. It's basically a tax haven for whoever, whether that's some Russian oligarch or a German industrialist or something, or a politician or something. Um, and also, its neutrality is guaranteed by a treaty it has with Switzerland. So Switzerland basically um, watches over it, so to speak. So that's one to mention. Austria. Austria's neutrality came into being through the nature that modern Austria was formed before it was independent after World War II. It was like Germany, split up between the Western and Eastern powers of the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and so on and so forth. But they came to a deal, and they said, right, we don't want Austria to be a site for us to fight over and war over. We're going to create this country and we're going to put it into its own constitution that it cannot join either side. And that's how both of them went, yeah, all right, let's create Austria rather than go, oh, we need Austria to be communist or it needs to be capitalist or whatever. They just created it and said, as long as it's neutral, it doesn't matter. Turkmenistan, I thought, was a very small little case study of a place largely unknown. That's in Central Asia. It's mostly desert and things like that, but that's got a permanent neutrality status that it signed after it gained independence. I imagine the reason why they did that was simply because they don't have any enemies really, and they don't really need to get involved anywhere because they're so sort of out of the way of anywhere of strategic importance, to be honest. So they did that, and that gives them a bit more international reliability, and I think it attracts a bit more trade to them. Panama, I think, is neutral. That's an American case. Anyone who knows much about Panama, it's got a very important canal that connects the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans effectively. And yeah, yeah, and the other thing about Panama as well, worth noting, it's neutral, obviously. Is that it is, I'm pretty sure, the largest holder of vessels in the world, of civilian ships in the world, because one, because it's neutral, and two, because of that neutrality, mixed by its low taxes for ships that are registered under it. Um, Countries all over the world, of independent companies want to sign on to being, oh, we're a Panamanian ship because we're not involved, we're not going to be in any wars or anywhere, so we can continue trading as we can or as we should. And the other one listed is Egypt, but I'm pretty sure that's only in the Suez Canal zone, and that's because of the context to how the Suez came to be Egyptian after the Suez Canal crisis. There was a big fight over it because Egypt tried to nationalize it, Britain tried to retake it and recontrol it under their control, and the UN, after a big international roundup of pretty much every country in the world against Britain and France and Israel, um, it basically fell to the UN's control, and they in turn said Egypt gets it, but it has to be neutral ground. Egypt cannot legally say this ship cannot come through, or this ship because it's Russian, or this ship because it's British cannot come through, and that is a case of a sort of a regional neutral zone within a country. Mm. Um, yeah, Natar is well, aside from it being very internally fractious, it's also very trade oriented and so forth. And quite a, I suppose years prior to the 3AW even like beginning to culminate, it made a declaration of neutrality as a way of helping to introduce more and more investment into it. It said, you know, we're a place, we're open for business and so forth. So it's become a top. It's kind of Panama as well in the sense that it has low taxes and stuff. So that combination does everything to um, inspire confidence in investors and stuff. So for that reason, it's sort of an economic center. Um, but the trade-off is that it's neutral in that sense. It doesn't want to cause capital flight by joining sides or getting involved in wars and that kind of thing. So it's neutral in the sense that it doesn't want to cause internal fracture because it's got all these different ideologies in different countries. So getting into war is a big faff and it takes a lot of political paperwork. Um, and it's also externally helpful because it makes other countries comfortable and companies comfortable with trading. So yeah, that's Natal. So true. That's not true. That's not true. That's not true. We're being benevolent.
Slander.
I mean, I could. I'm not prepared for this, but I could. Um, my nation, Vaplana, is very pro-neutral, but it's mainly because they don't have a military at all to like defend themselves if anything were to like come of them joining a side. So it's more out of like necessity than anything else. But they're also like really known for peacekeeping and stuff like that. So joining a side would like harm their reputation in that regard as well. So they just kind of refuse to get involved with anything, even though they have like more ties with one side than another. They just don't want to have anything to do with it, essentially.
Minson's another independent, neutral one, isn't it? Minson.
I had to unmute. But to be fair, the first and Ancerious War, I don't really. I consider that like half canon in the sense that I'm a completely different person and didn't even remember doing that when Blue brought it up a few months ago. But um, 2AW, Carnath was not interested in getting into a prolonged war after the first one. Uh, and despite denouncing capital and being part of the reason the war started, still wanted to maintain some form of relations and prevent major conflict. Only really joining in earnest because of invasions of their own systems, as well as the use of the Crucible to attack their capital system. Oh yeah, they did oppose the execution of Inara at the end of the war.
To go about attacking people. Really simply. I mean, like, not as in like, oh, painting yourself in different colors. Just literally just going around. If you start attacking other countries, even if you're not in an alliance, if you go about attacking, potentially, let's say there's an alliance one and alliance two, right? I don't know too much about them, but in this, okay, well, in this hypothetical, you got Alliance One, Alliance Two, and they're fighting each other and all that kind of thing. And then you got Country One and Country Two, and they're separate, right? They're not in the alliance, but they have a big old, oh, I hate Country Two or whatever. Okay, Country Two's imperialist, and they did all this stuff. They displaced a bunch of natives or whatever. If Country One then attacks Country Two, they might both be outside of these alliances, but now suddenly Country 2 has everything to gain from joining one of the alliances. So you've just dragged yourself into the war because now you've just in the middle of a massive galactic war, you've started a tiny war, which by natural interests of both sides, they want as much support as they can get. One of them's going to quickly join an alliance or something, or get support from one side. So don't start attacking other countries during a massive galactic war if you're neutral, even if the other side's not in the alliance, because it's almost certainly going to get like naturally force you or pull you into the scope of a bigger war. I can't.
Yeah, so I missed part of this, so this may have already been answered, but like I'm playing like a very like religious cult-like nation that doesn't like have obvious political ties. What's the best way to do like to work, as a nation? Should I be like taking a neutral tack or like actively working as like using diplomacy as a tool to spread ideology? What would be gotcha.
Yeah, like a big case is the interesting thing with religion, unless it's a religious war, is that it's a completely different dimension to the war. You know, it's territorial, but religion itself, um, you can be religious, but you can have a certain political view or a different one entirely, right? So if you're playing as a religious, all I'd say, oh, is he gone?
Yeah.
Oh, anyway, well, to answer the question is, if you're on one political side or whatever, if you're like a religion, you can either say, all right, this person's in this side's in the wrong. We call on all good, for example, real life, you go, or we'll call on all good Christians or whatever to go against this side or whatever. Then you're obviously going to side with that group. But the problem is, while you might get support from that, from a side for doing that, you're also, because people have competing loyalties between religion or a political view, you'll also cause a large swathe of your following to now drop out or to be disillusioned or to set up a schism or to side somewhere else. So that's just something to consider if you're playing a religious thing. Is side taking generally isn't good if you're trying to just capture as many people, capture the largest audience, so to speak, for your message. Even if it is more principled, so there's a case of principle versus practicality there. You don't want to ostracize people. But that would be my answer. On top of that, I'll add to answer the question, Cora. At least on the Somalia side of it, from what I can read about it, it's a bit like the Korean War in the sense that the UN basically went, okay, we're gonna get this giant group around, or we're gonna form this giant coalition, and we're gonna go take out this specific group, this warlord or whatever, or we're gonna take out this side. They're in the wrong. And in that sense, I think it's difficult to say because it's basically a war, isn't it? It's difficult to say that that's a neutral move, but it is neutral in the sense that it's something sanctioned internationally. So it's something that it's not like if that operation failed,
suddenly the United Somali Congress, who the war was against, is suddenly going to go, right, we've won, now to go to war with Algeria, Australia, Austria, Bangladesh, Belgium, Botswana. It's not like that. So it's not neutral, but it's kind of like a conflict that you're immune to repercussions for, right? Because you're not really doing it. It's something that you only contributed a bit of your force towards someone else's move. But that's what I'd say to that.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, the classics, America.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't technically neutral, but at the end, it was sort of like it's a case that you came out economically healthy. The countries that were in the war or were directly involved in the war in terms of its combat radius, they were atrophied and they were depleted, and so these countries now had, after World War One, America, did all these things. Germany came to them and said, "Okay, we need can you give relief for these wars? Can you forgive us on these loans or whatever?" And America went, "Yeah, sure," as a move to expand influence or to get them in these different things or to make sure this government stays strong or whatever. So you can certainly do that. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.